The training hall smelled of old wood, sweat, and faint traces of the oil they used to keep the mats from drying out. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, their pale glow bouncing off walls lined with framed calligraphy and photographs of past masters frozen in stern poses. The young recruits stood in loose ranks, shifting slightly on tired legs after a long day of drills. For most of them, this was just another test in a long series of tests, but when the instructor's eyes swept across the line and finally landed on her, something in the air changed. She felt it as clearly as she felt the chill of the mat beneath her bare feet. Her name had been whispered among them for weeks now, not because she was loud or boastful, but because she was quiet and carried herself with a confidence that unsettled the others. She had moved through every exercise with precision, her strikes crisp, her balance unshakable, and her calm demeanor unbroken. It wasn't bravado, it was something deeper, something that suggested she wasn't here just to learn, she was here to prove. The instructor, a man with a wide chest, scarred forearms, and the calm authority of someone who had taught hundreds before, barked the command. "You. Step forward." His voice carried across the hall like a crack of thunder, and she obeyed without hesitation. Her ponytail swayed lightly as she moved, and though her face revealed nothing more than a small, polite smile, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a ripple of unease through the recruits who watched. They had all been told what it meant to spar with the instructor. He was not gentle, and he did not allow anyone to coast through. To step into the ring with him was to be tested to the breaking point, to be humbled, and to be reminded how far you still had to go. Yet as she bowed lightly in front of him, that faint smile never left her lips. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't mockery. It was something that said she already knew the outcome, and that knowledge made the others whisper nervously among themselves. The instructor raised an eyebrow but said nothing, stepping into stance with the kind of fluidity that came only from decades of discipline. His arms lifted, his feet slid across the mat with deliberate ease, and his gaze sharpened into a predator's focus. "Show me what you've learned," he said simply. She inhaled once, exhaled slowly, and mirrored his stance with a grace that seemed almost too natural, as if she had been waiting for this moment all her life. There was no tension in her shoulders, no tremor in her hands. She was loose, calm, and perfectly balanced. The instructor noted it instantly, though he did not let it show on his face. He lunged first, testing her reflexes with a sharp feint followed by a low sweep. The motion was fast, calculated to catch a beginner off guard, but her body moved like water, flowing back just enough that the sweep passed in front of her shin without contact. Her hands came up, not striking, not rushing, just redirecting his energy with a subtle push that forced him to reset his footing. The recruits gasped quietly. They had never seen anyone move so smoothly against him. The instructor narrowed his eyes and came in harder this time, fists snapping in quick combinations meant to overwhelm. Each strike cracked through the air, but her blocks were sharp, precise, and shockingly efficient. She didn't flinch, didn't stumble. She parried and shifted, her feet gliding across the mat as if she had choreographed this exchange long before it happened. Her smile widened a fraction, the kind of smile that suggested she was no longer warming up. She was ready. When the instructor threw a heavy straight punch, she didn't just block. She slipped past it, pivoted sharply, and seized his wrist with startling speed. Her grip locked like iron, and before he could counter, her other hand hooked his shoulder. In a single fluid motion, she twisted her hips and applied leverage with the kind of ruthless precision that only came from mastering not just technique, but the understanding of anatomy itself. There was a sickening pop, sharp and final, as his shoulder gave way under the torque. The sound echoed across the hall like the snapping of dry wood. For one frozen second, no one moved. The instructor staggered, his face contorting in shock and pain as his arm dangled unnaturally at his side. The recruits' jaws dropped, their disbelief painted clearly on every wide-eyed face. She released him gently, almost respectfully, as though she had only performed a necessary step in a dance. Her smile remained, calm and unwavering, as if she had known from the very start that this was exactly how it would end. The silence was suffocating. The only sound was the instructor's ragged breathing as he cradled his injured shoulder. Then, slowly he looked at her, not with anger, not with humiliation, but with something far heavier. It was respect, reluctant and begrudging, but respect nonetheless. He had faced hundreds of students, broken down countless egos, and yet here stood someone who had not only survived him but had bested him in a matter of seconds. He understood in that moment that she was not like the others. She was not here to learn the basics. She was here to test the limits of those who thought they had nothing left to learn. The recruits whispered among themselves, their voices trembling as though they weren't sure whether they had just witnessed brilliance or madness. Some were terrified of her, others awestruck, but none could look away. She bowed once more, her eyes never leaving the instructors, and then stepped back into line as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The faint smile lingered, not cruel, not mocking, simply certain, as if she had only proven what she already knew. The instructor straightened slowly despite the pain, his pride demanding that he not show weakness in front of his students. He raised his good hand and gestured toward her. "Remember this," he said hoarsely, his voice roughened by pain but sharpened by conviction. "Strength is not about size or power or even speed. It is about knowing exactly where to strike, and having the will to do it without hesitation." His words echoed in the silence, and though none of the recruits fully understood them in that moment, they would never forget the lesson carved into their memory by the sound of his shoulder breaking under her hand. The session ended soon after, the instructor excusing himself without ceremony as another senior assistant took over. The recruits were dismissed, but none of them left right away. They lingered, clustering together in hushed groups, their eyes darting toward her again and again. She ignored the attention, calmly retrieving her bag from the side of the hall and tying her jacket around her waist. To her, it had not been about showing off or humiliating the instructor or proving dominance. It had been about something else entirely, something personal, something that drove her every time she stepped onto the mat. She had trained too long, carried too much, and come too far to be treated as just another face in the crowd. Every move she made was fueled by the weight of that unseen burden, and when she snapped the instructor's shoulder, it wasn't an accident, it was inevitability. As she stepped out into the fading sunlight, the cool air brushed across her face, and she closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. The murmurs of the recruits followed her even as the doors closed behind her. She knew what they were thinking, what they were feeling. Fear, respect, curiosity. It didn't matter. Let them whisper. Let them wonder. What mattered was that she had once again proven to herself that no one, no instructor, no opponent, no obstacle, would ever break her stride. And though she walked away silently, her smile remained, carrying with it the promise that this was only the beginning. The night after the sparring match carried a different kind of weight in the dormitories where the recruits slept. Conversations that usually drifted around grades, drills, and weekend plans were replaced with one repeated question. Who exactly was she? The recruits spoke in hushed voices, afraid she might hear them even through the thin walls. Some swore she must have trained for years under secret masters. Others whispered she had been part of something darker, something outside the tidy discipline of academies and schools. One boy insisted she had once been a fighter in underground tournaments, another was convinced she had military experience that no one else had been told about. None of them knew the truth, and the mystery only deepened their unease. She, meanwhile, slept soundly, untroubled by the storm of curiosity she had left behind. To her, snapping the instructor's shoulder had been nothing more than another step on a road she had already walked for years. Morning brought no respite from the murmurs. As the recruits lined up for roll call, eyes flicked constantly in her direction. She did not respond, did not even glance their way, as though their attention simply slid off her like water off polished stone. Her focus was unshaken, locked firmly on the rhythm of the day's training. When the replacement instructor arrived, a stern woman with a voice like steel and an expression that brooked no nonsense, there was a brief moment of tension. Everyone expected a lecture about discipline, about respect, about the consequences of going too far. But none came. The woman acknowledged the class, issued the day's orders, and moved them straight into grueling physical drills. It was almost as if the incident had never happened. Yet beneath the surface nothing felt normal at all. For the recruits, push-ups, sprints, and forms were performed with half their usual focus, their gazes continually sliding back toward her. They wanted to see if she would slip, if the legend beginning to form around her was nothing more than a one-time fluke. But if they hoped for weakness, they found none. Her movements were as precise and tireless as ever, every repetition crisp, her breathing controlled, her face set in that same calm mask that unsettled them all. Sweat gleamed on her skin, but she never faltered, never grimaced, never revealed strain. The harder the instructor pushed them, the more it seemed to feed her resolve. She was not simply enduring the drills, she was thriving in them, her body moving with the effortless efficiency of someone who had long ago made struggle into second nature. By midday, exhaustion had thinned the recruits' ranks. Some staggered, some collapsed outright, their lungs burning, their arms trembling too violently to hold their weight. She, however, stood tall, her breathing even, her expression unchanged. The female instructor noticed. Unlike the man from before, she did not dismiss it or overlook it. She watched closely, her sharp eyes narrowing with each new display of stamina. At last she called a halt and ordered water. The recruits collapsed onto benches and mats, grateful for the reprieve. She sat with them but not among them, always just slightly apart, as if separation was her natural state. It was then that one of the braver recruits, a wiry young man with more curiosity than sense, spoke up. "Hey," he said between gulps of water, his voice pitched just loud enough for the others to hear. "What are you really doing here? People don't just break an instructor in one move like that. Who taught you?" The others turned, waiting for her response. She glanced at him briefly, her gaze so steady that he shifted uncomfortably under it. For a moment it seemed she might not answer at all. Then, in that same calm voice that carried neither pride nor apology, she said, "Life." The single word cut through the murmurs like a blade. She offered no elaboration, no story, no explanation. Just life. It was enough to shut them down, but it was also enough to ignite their imaginations even further. The recruits traded uneasy looks, each of them silently filling the gaps with their own theories. For her, though, the word was truth. Every scar on her body, every instinct in her movements, every ounce of steel in her heart had been forged in the harshest of circumstances long before she ever set foot in this academy. Training halls and instructors were just the polish. The raw edge of her skill had been carved by survival. The afternoon drills shifted to partner exercises, pairing recruits together for grappling and defensive techniques. None wanted to be paired with her, though no one dared say it outright. Eventually, the female instructor made the decision herself, assigning her to work with the same boy who had questioned her. His face paled, but he did not protest. They squared off on the mat, his body stiff with nerves. She gave him a faint nod, the same small smile that had unnerved the male instructor the day before, and then moved into position. He lunged awkwardly, driven more by fear than skill, and in a heartbeat she had flipped him neatly onto his back, her knee hovering an inch from his chest. She helped him up afterward, calm as ever, but the message was clear, her control was absolute. She could break him just as easily as she had broken the instructor, and the only reason she did not was because she chose not to. As the day wore on, the whispers among the recruits turned into something more complicated. There was fear still, yes, but also something closer to admiration. Some began to mimic her posture, her breathing, her balance, trying to draw even a fraction of her calm into themselves. Others kept their distance, unwilling to risk attracting her notice. The female instructor, however, remained watchful, her sharp gaze following the girl's every move. At the end of the session, when the recruits were dismissed, she called out to her, stopping her at the door. "Stay behind." The recruits froze, ears straining to catch what might follow, but the instructor dismissed them firmly, and they had no choice but to leave. She waited until the hall was empty, then approached the girl. Up close, her presence was formidable, the kind of authority that usually bent students into silence. But the girl did not bend. She stood straight, hands loosely at her sides, her expression unreadable. The instructor studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "You're not here to learn the basics," she said. It wasn't a question. The girl tilted her head slightly, the barest hint of that smile touching her lips. "No," she agreed softly. "Then why are you here?" the instructor pressed. For the first time, a shadow crossed her expression, something deeper stirring beneath the calm surface. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the rows of photographs on the wall, past masters frozen in time, men and women who had built their reputations on discipline, strength, and legacy. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but heavy. Because sometimes the best way to hide a blade is in plain sight. The instructor frowned, but before she could respond, the girl bowed politely and left, her footsteps echoing down the empty hall. Alone now, the instructor stood in silence, her mind racing. She had seen many students, many prodigies, many who thought themselves destined for greatness. But this was different. This girl was not training to become strong, she already was. And the question that now hung in the air was not whether she would rise above the others, but what she intended to do once she had. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy balance between routine and rumor. On the surface, the academy functioned as it always had. Drills at dawn, lessons through the day, sparring in the evenings. Yet beneath the structured order, the presence of the girl who had dismantled an instructor in seconds hung over everything like a shadow. Recruits who had once been quick to laugh, to joke, now kept their voices low when she passed. Some watched her with awe, others with suspicion, and still others with a silent fear they couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just her skill that unsettled them, it was the calm certainty in her every move, as if she walked through their world already knowing exactly how each moment would unfold. The female instructor, however, did not let the incident fade into whispers. She pushed the class harder each day, and though she never singled the girl out by name, her gaze lingered on her more often than not, sharp and probing, as if waiting for something else to reveal itself. If the girl noticed, she gave no sign. Her demeanor never wavered, her faint smile never left, and her performance never dipped below perfection. Whether running sprints until the recruits collapsed, striking pads until their knuckles bled, or grappling on the mats until their limbs ached, she remained unshaken, moving with the same fluid grace and controlled power that had already made her a legend among them. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of sparring, the recruits sprawled in the mess hall, shoveling down food with the desperation of the exhausted. The hall was filled with the clatter of trays and the low hum of weary voices. She sat at the far end of a long table, alone as always, eating with the same calm precision that defined everything she did. A group of recruits nearby kept glancing at her, their whispers just barely audible over the noise. Finally, one of them, a broad-shouldered boy with a bruised jaw from that day's training, stood and approached her. The hall quieted slightly, curiosity drawing eyes toward the confrontation. He stopped across from her, tray in hand, his voice uncertain but loud enough for all to hear. "Why don't you ever tell us who you are?" he asked. "Everyone's wondering. You don't fight like us, you don't train like us. You don't even look tired when the rest of us can barely stand. What are you hiding?" Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for a long moment she said nothing. The boy shifted uneasily, his bravado beginning to waver under the weight of her silence. Then at last she set her fork down and leaned back slightly. "Do you really want to know?" she asked, her tone calm, almost gentle. The boy hesitated, but pride forced him to nod. Her smile touched her lips again, but this time it was thinner, sharper. "The truth is simple. While you were playing games, I was surviving. While you were dreaming about becoming strong, I was learning that weakness meant death. You wonder why I don't get tired, why I don't break, why I don't hesitate. It's because I learned long ago that hesitation gets you buried. That's all you need to know." The words landed like blows, silencing not just the boy but the entire hall. She picked up her fork again, returning to her meal as if nothing more needed to be said. The boy retreated awkwardly, his pride bruised far worse than his jaw. The other recruits stared, some unsettled, some oddly inspired. A few looked away entirely, unable to meet her gaze. The atmosphere in the mess hall shifted that night, the invisible line between her and the others etched even deeper. She was no longer simply one of them, she was something else entirely, and whether that was a gift or a curse, none could say. Later, when the hall had emptied and the lights dimmed, she remained seated alone, her tray pushed aside. For the first time that day her expression shifted, the mask slipping just slightly. Her smile faded, replaced by something harder, heavier. Memories stirred unbidden, memories she usually kept buried beneath layers of discipline. A dimly lit alley, the smell of smoke and blood, the sound of fists striking flesh, the echo of a voice telling her to get up or die where she fell. She had been younger then, smaller, weaker. But every fall had taught her how to rise, every wound had taught her how to fight, and every loss had burned away another layer of fear. By the time she had found her way to the academy, she was not seeking strength, she was seeking control. And control, she reminded herself, was the one thing she could never afford to lose. The next morning, the recruits were ordered outside for endurance training. The sun was barely over the horizon, the air sharp with early chill. Weighted packs were strapped to their backs, and they were sent running across uneven terrain that tested every muscle in their bodies. The recruits groaned and staggered, their endurance stretched to its breaking point. She, however, ran at the front of the pack, her stride steady, her breathing controlled. Each step was deliberate, efficient, as though her body knew no other way to move. The female instructor followed at a distance, watching closely, her suspicion deepening with every mile. By the time they returned, many recruits collapsed on the grass, their legs trembling, their lungs burning. She dropped her pack without a word, her posture still straight, her eyes as calm as ever. The instructor approached her directly this time, stepping close enough that the recruits could sense the tension. "You don't tire," the instructor said quietly. "You don't slip. You don't falter. Why?" The girl tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "Because I don't allow myself to," she answered simply. The instructor studied her, clearly unsatisfied but unwilling to press further in front of the others. Instead, she called the recruits to attention and dismissed them for the day. Yet the question lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. Why indeed? That evening, in the dim quiet of the dormitory, one of the younger recruits gathered enough courage to approach her. She was sitting on her bunk, carefully wrapping cloth around her hands, the repetitive motion oddly soothing. "Can I ask you something?" the recruit whispered. She looked up, her expression neutral. "Why did you smile when you fought the instructor? When you broke his shoulder? Why were you smiling?" For the first time she seemed caught off guard. The question lingered between them, heavier than it should have been. Slowly she set the cloth aside. "Because," she said at last, her voice softer than the recruit had ever heard it, "that smile isn't for them. It's for me. It reminds me that I'm still here, that I'm still in control. If I stop smiling, it means I've lost something I can't get back." The recruit nodded slowly, not fully understanding but sensing the weight behind the words. She returned to wrapping her hands, her faint smile resurfacing, though this time it looked less like calm certainty and more like a fragile shield against something darker. The recruit left quietly, but the question and its answer spread soon enough. And as it did, the legend around her grew, twisting into something even more untouchable. She was no longer just the girl who broke the instructor. She was the girl who smiled while doing it, and that image etched itself deep into the minds of everyone who saw her. The Academy's rhythm moved on, but the undercurrent surrounding her presence only grew stronger. Rumors traveled faster than truth, and soon she became more myth than recruit. Some whispered she had military blood, raised by soldiers who had carved discipline into her bones before she could walk. Others insisted she was from a violent underground circuit, a fighter who had broken bones and spilled blood long before she wore the Academy's uniform. Every sparring match she entered only fueled the speculation. She never lost. She never flinched. And she always smiled, that faint, unshakable curve of her lips that unsettled even those who admired her. Her skill could have made her arrogant, but she moved through the days with the same steady calm, showing neither pride nor disdain. That, more than anything, confused the recruits. Those who excelled usually flaunted it, hungry for recognition, desperate to stand out. She seemed uninterested in any of it. When praised, she gave a polite nod. When whispered about, she gave no reaction at all. She trained with the same quiet dedication whether eyes were on her or not. It was as though she existed in a world slightly apart from theirs, following rules that only she understood. The female instructor, however, was not content to let her remain a mystery. She began assigning her to increasingly difficult tasks, pairing her against the strongest recruits, pushing her to the front during endurance runs, forcing her into leadership roles during team drills. Each time the girl met the challenge without hesitation. When the instructor paired her against two recruits at once in sparring, she flowed between them like water, redirecting their energy until both were pinned to the mat in less than a minute. When she was ordered to lead a team through an obstacle course, she completed it faster and cleaner than any group had before, her voice calm, her commands precise. The instructor watched with a calculating eye, searching for cracks, for flaws, for the human limits that every recruit was supposed to have. Yet she found none. One evening, after another grueling day, the instructor called her aside. The recruits lingered, straining to listen, but the instructor's voice was low, meant only for her. "You don't belong here," she said bluntly. "Not because you're unworthy, but because this place can't teach you anything you don't already know. So why are you here?" The girl's faint smile surfaced, but this time her eyes held something heavier. "Because everyone needs a place to stand still for a while," she answered. "Even blades need a sheath." She bowed politely and walked away, leaving the instructor unsettled. The words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind of weight that came from someone who had seen far too much for her years. That night, sleep did not come easily. The dormitory was quiet, the recruits exhausted and sprawled across their bunks. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts drifting to places she rarely allowed herself to visit. She remembered faces, some kind, some cruel, some long gone. She remembered nights spent fighting not for points or praise, but for survival, where a single mistake meant the end. She remembered the sting of blood in her eyes, the ache in her bones, the voice in her head that had whispered over and over, "Get up, get up, get up." Those memories were why she never faltered now, why she never let herself appear tired, why she smiled even when the weight of the world pressed down on her. Weakness had once cost her everything. She would never pay that price again. The following week brought an unexpected change. The Academy hosted visiting officers, hardened veterans who came to observe the recruits, to identify potential for special assignments. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Recruits straightened, sharpened, desperate to impress. The air buzzed with nerves and ambition. She, however, remained unchanged. Her calm presence seemed only to magnify in contrast to the others' restless energy. When the officers entered the training hall, their eyes swept across the room, pausing only briefly before moving on. but when they saw her they lingered. Something about the way she carried herself, steady and unshaken, drew their attention. During demonstrations, recruits stumbled over themselves to prove worth, but she executed every task with the same effortless precision as always. The officers conferred quietly, their interest obvious. At last, one of them, a tall man with scars tracing down his neck, stepped forward. "You," he said, pointing at her. "With me." The recruits exchanged uneasy glances as she stepped forward without hesitation. She followed him to a separate ring where another officer waited. The two men exchanged a look, then the scarred one said, "We've heard stories. Let's see if they're true." They sent in a seasoned fighter, one of their own men, to test her. He was larger, older, his body marked by years of combat. The recruits held their breath, sensing that this was not a simple sparring exercise. The fight began quickly, the man striking with brutal force, his movements sharp and heavy. She met him head-on, her body flowing around his strikes, her counters precise. Where he was strength, she was speed. Where he was power, she was precision. The clash was short, but it ended decisively. With a sharp pivot and a lock, she drove him to the mat, immobilizing him in seconds. The hall fell silent, the recruits stunned all over again. The scarred officer studied her closely, his expression unreadable. Finally he nodded. "Interesting," he said. He dismissed the fighter and turned to the female instructor. "She doesn't belong in this group. She's wasted here." The instructor crossed her arms, her expression tight. "I know," she admitted. The officers left soon after, but their presence left ripples. The recruits buzzed with speculation, their whispers more fevered than ever. Some believed she would be pulled from the academy, taken into some secret unit. Others feared she would be set apart permanently, unreachable to them. She ignored the talk as always, but inside she felt the shift too. The officers had seen her, truly seen her, and once seen, she could not remain hidden for long. That night, she stood outside the dormitory, the cool air brushing against her skin. She looked up at the stars, their distant lights scattered across the dark. For a long time, she stood still, her faint smile fading as she whispered words only she could hear. "I can't stay invisible forever." The truth pressed on her chest like a weight. She had come to the academy to blend in, to find a place where she could exist quietly, sharpening her edge in peace. But peace was never meant for her. The world always found a way to drag her back into its battles, to test the strength she had been forced to build. Behind her, the dormitory lights flickered, and the muffled voices of recruits drifted through the night. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, steadying herself. Whatever came next, whether more challenges, more suspicion, or the return of the shadows she thought she had left behind, she would face it as she always had. With calm. With precision. With that faint, unshakable smile. Because she knew, perhaps better than anyone, that survival was not about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about never letting the world see you break. And she had promised herself long ago that she never would. The days after the officer's visit felt heavier, as if the entire academy had shifted on its axis. Recruits whispered more than ever, their voices sharper with speculation, their eyes darting toward her with a mix of fear and fascination. She noticed, of course, she noticed everything, but she gave no reaction, moving through her routines with the same calm precision as always. To her, whispers were only noise. What mattered was control, and control meant never letting the noise reach her center. Still, she could feel the current of change beneath the surface, pulling her toward something she had tried to avoid since the day she walked into the academy. Attention. And attention was dangerous. The female instructor seemed to sense it too. She watched more closely now, her gaze sharp, her silence weighted. She no longer tried to push the girl into failure, she had stopped believing failure was even possible for her. Instead, she studied her, searching not for weakness in skill but for cracks in her composure. Because everyone, no matter how strong, had a breaking point. The question was not whether the girl had won, it was what would happen when someone finally forced it out of her. One evening, after a brutal session of combat drills, the recruits dragged themselves back to the dormitory, their bodies aching, their minds dulled by exhaustion. But she was not among them. The instructor had asked her to remain behind. Alone now in the silent hall, she stood at the center of the mat while the instructor circled slowly around her. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" the instructor asked, her voice low, almost conversational. The girl tilted her head slightly, her faint smile unbroken. "What do you see?" "A weapon," the instructor replied. "Sharp, efficient, deadly. But a weapon without purpose cuts indiscriminately. Tell me, who put that edge in you? Who made you into this?" For the first time in weeks, the girl's smile flickered. Her eyes dropped just for a second before rising again. Life, she answered, the same word she had given before. But this time, it carried a heavier weight, as if beneath it lay 1,000 unspoken stories. The instructor studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Life may have sharpened you, she said, but life also breaks blades when they're pushed too far. Remember that. With that, she dismissed her. That night, the girl sat awake on her bunk long after the others had fallen asleep. The dormitory was filled with the steady rhythm of breathing, but her mind would not quiet. She thought of the instructor's words, of the officer's eyes on her, of the whispers that grew louder each day. She had come to the academy to disappear, to bury herself in the routines of others, to hide her sharpened edge within the appearance of discipline and training. But the world refused to let her vanish. Every time she tried to step into the background, fate pulled her to the front, forcing her to prove herself again and again. And though she smiled, though she remained calm, a part of her wondered how long she could keep the past from bleeding into the present. The answer came sooner than she expected. It began quietly, with unfamiliar faces at the edge of the training grounds. Men in plain clothes standing too still, watching too intently. The recruits barely noticed, too busy with their drills, but she saw them instantly. Their posture, their silence, the way their eyes tracked her more than anyone else, it told her everything she needed to know. They weren't spectators. They weren't parents or officials. They were hunters. That evening, as the recruits left the hall, she lingered near the doorway, her eyes narrowing toward the shadowed figures beyond the fence. They made no move, but she could feel the weight of their presence. Memories she had locked away stirred like restless ghosts. Nights when men just like them had dragged her into fights she hadn't chosen, pitting her against opponents for money and entertainment, treating her body and her skill as tools for their gain. She had escaped that life, left it buried behind her, but now the scent of it was back in the air, sharp and unmistakable. The female instructor noticed her stillness and followed her gaze. Her sharp eyes caught the figures too, and for the first time she understood that the girl's mystery was not just about talent or survival. Something darker had shaped her, something that was now reaching into the academy itself. She stepped closer, her voice low. "Do you know them?" The girl's smile was thin, almost brittle. "I know what they want." "And what is that?" Her eyes stayed locked on the shadows. "To remind me that no matter how far you run, someone is always willing to pull you back." She turned then, her expression composed once more, but the smile had sharpened into something colder. That night she did not sleep. She sat on her bunk in silence, her body still but her mind restless. Every creak of the dormitory, every whisper of wind against the window, set her nerves on edge. She knew what would come. She knew they would not wait long. And she knew that when they finally made their move, she would not have the luxury of restraint. The strike came 2 nights later. The recruits were returning from evening drills when the lights in the dormitory flickered and cut out. Darkness swallowed the hallways, broken only by the faint glow of emergency lamps. Panic rippled through the recruits, their tired voices rising in confusion. She stood perfectly still, her eyes narrowing as her ears caught sounds the others missed. The soft scrape of boots against tile, the faint metallic click of a weapon being readied. "Stay down," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the chaos. The recruits froze, startled by the command, but something in her tone rooted them to the spot. Then the doors burst open, and the shadows she had been waiting for poured in. Men in dark clothing, their movements coordinated and precise, swept through the dormitory. They weren't here for the recruits. They were here for her. She moved before they could reach her, her body a blur of motion. The first man lunged and she slipped past him, driving her elbow into his ribs with enough force to drop him instantly. The second swung a baton, but she caught his wrist, twisted, and sent him crashing into the bunk frame. Around her, the recruits screamed and scrambled, but she was a storm of calm violence, every strike precise, every movement lethal. The female instructor arrived moments later, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. She didn't hesitate. She joined the fight, her strikes sharp and efficient, but even she couldn't ignore the way the girl moved, faster, sharper, deadlier. It wasn't academy training. It was survival honed into something far more dangerous. Within minutes, the attackers were on the ground, groaning or unconscious. The recruits huddled in stunned silence, staring at her as though she had transformed before their eyes. She stood over the fallen men, her chest rising and falling steadily, her faint smile returning as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the look in her eyes was darker now, touched by something the recruits couldn't understand. The instructor stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Who are they?" she demanded. The girl's smile lingered, but her words were quiet. People who thought I still belonged to them. She glanced at the recruits, their wide eyes fixed on her, and then back at the instructor. Now you know why I came here. Not to learn. Not to lead. To hide. The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, the recruits saw her not as untouchable, not as a myth, but as someone carrying a past that refused to let her go. And as she stood there, calm and unbroken amidst the wreckage, one truth settled over them all. Whatever her story truly was, it was far from over. The dormitory had been reduced to silence after the chaos, the recruits sitting frozen on their bunks with wide, shell-shocked eyes. The men in black lay scattered across the floor, groaning or unconscious, some too broken to move. The emergency lamps cast their pale glow over the scene, painting it in stark shadows that made everything look even more surreal. She stood at the center of it all, her breathing steady, her faint smile resting on her lips as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But beneath that calm exterior, her mind raced. She knew what came next. The attack wasn't just about reclaiming her. It was a message, a warning that she could never outrun the past she had tried to bury. The female instructor was the first to break the silence, her voice sharp and commanding. "Secure them," she barked to the recruits, though most of them still trembled too much to move. A few found their strength and scrambled to tie the attackers with belts and sheets torn from bunks. The instructor's eyes never left the girl. "You knew this was coming," she said, her voice low enough that only she could hear. The girl's smile softened just slightly, though it never vanished. "I always know," she murmured. By the time military security arrived, the dormitory was a spectacle. Sirens wailed outside, boots thundered through the hallways, and armed soldiers flooded the room. The unconscious men were dragged away, their weapons confiscated, their identities recorded. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the way the officers looked at her, their expressions sharpened into something colder, more calculating than before. They had suspected she was different. Now they knew. The recruits whispered even louder in the following days, but this time the whispers weren't laced with jealousy or idle curiosity. They were thick with fear. They had seen her unleash something that no one in the academy could match, not even the instructors. It was no longer about whether she was talented or strong. It was about what she was, and what that meant for everyone around her. The instructors too moved differently. The male instructor avoided her entirely now, his arrogance dissolved into wary silence. The female instructor, however, drew closer, her sharp eyes watching her every move. One afternoon she pulled her aside after drills, leading her into an empty hall where their voices wouldn't carry. "They'll come back," the instructor said bluntly. The girl tilted her head slightly, her smile faint as ever. "I know. And when they do, it won't just be a handful of men in the dark. It'll be bigger, smarter, harder to fight." Her eyes gleamed, calm and unwavering. "Then I'll fight harder." The instructor studied her for a long moment, then leaned closer. "You think you can fight forever, but you can't. Even the sharpest blade dulls when it's forced to cut too many times. You need to tell me what you're running from. You need to give me something, or I can't help you when the next wave comes." For the first time, her smile faded completely. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally she spoke, her voice softer than a whisper. "There was a man," she said. "A man who made me into something I didn't want to be. He used me, trained me, made me fight for him. I broke away, but men like him never forget what they lose. He'll keep sending shadows until one of them drags me back." She turned then, her smile snapping back into place like a mask. "And that's all I'll say." The instructor wanted to press further, but she saw in the girl's eyes that the wall would not break. Not tonight. So she simply nodded and let her walk away. The academy tried to carry on as usual, but the balance had shifted. Extra guards patrolled the grounds, surveillance tightened, schedules adjusted. But all of it was useless and everyone knew it. Because this wasn't an enemy that could be stopped by security cameras or locked doors. This was an enemy that lived in shadows, slipping through cracks, always watching. And watch they did. The girl felt it every day, eyes on her from beyond the fences, unfamiliar faces at the edges of crowds, strangers who lingered too long before vanishing into the city beyond the gates. They weren't here to attack, not yet. They were waiting, studying, planning. The tension grew heavier with each passing day, pressing down on her shoulders like an old weight she had carried for too long. Then the officers returned. Not in secret this time, but openly, their polished boots echoing through the halls, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. They called her into a private chamber, the female instructor accompanying her as witness. The lead officer folded his hands on the table and leaned forward. "We know who those men were," he said evenly. "They belong to an organization that runs illegal fights across half the continent. We've been tracking them for years. And now they've come for you." She remained silent, her faint smile unbroken, though inside her chest tightened. The officer continued, his eyes sharp. "You were one of their fighters. That much is clear. What we want to know is why you left and why they're so determined to take you back." Her gaze dropped briefly to the table, then rose again. "Because I embarrassed them," she said quietly. "Because I won when I wasn't supposed to. Because I refused to break when they told me to. Men like that can't forgive defiance." The officers exchanged glances. One of them leaned back, his voice hard. "You've brought danger into this academy. That attack could have killed recruits. You understand that, don't you?" Her smile thinned, brittle but steady. "Danger follows me whether I'm here or anywhere else. If you think sending me away will protect them, you're wrong. They'll come anyway. They'll keep coming until they get what they want." The female instructor, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "And what they want is her. Not the academy. Not the recruits. Her. Which means if we cast her out, we'll only make their job easier." Her eyes locked on the officers with unflinching resolve. "She stays. And we prepare." The officers didn't like it. Their faces made that much clear. But they couldn't argue with the logic, not entirely. After a long silence, the lead officer finally nodded. "Very well. She stays. But know this, if the danger grows beyond our control, we won't hesitate to act. Do you understand?" The girl inclined her head slightly, her faint smile returning. "I always understand." When she walked out of that chamber, the recruits stared at her as though she carried fire in her veins. Some with fear, some with awe, but all with the awareness that she was no longer just one of them. She was something else entirely, something beyond their world. And for the first time she wondered if maybe she was no longer hiding. Maybe she was being sharpened once again, not by life this time, but by destiny. Night fell heavy that evening, the air thick with unease. She sat on her bunk, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her smile faint as ever. But her mind was already racing ahead, already imagining the moment when the shadows would strike again. Because they would. They always did. And when that time came she would be ready, not just for them but for the man who had sent them. For she knew now, with absolute clarity, that the fight was no longer about survival. It was about ending the past that hunted her. Once and for all. The night the man from her past revealed himself, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with a tension that clung to the academy grounds like fog. The guards had doubled their patrols, the instructors had tightened every routine, and yet she could sense it, that electric hum of danger before a storm. She lay awake on her bunk, eyes open to the shadows stretching across the ceiling, her body perfectly still but her thoughts sharp and restless. She knew he was close. Too close. For days she had felt his presence in the periphery, like a wolf circling the edge of firelight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And tonight the firelight was dimming. The silence of the dormitory was broken by a distant thud. Not the clumsy noise of recruits shifting in their sleep, not the creak of old wood. This was precise, deliberate. A sound meant to pass unnoticed, but her ears caught it instantly. She slipped from her bunk without a word, her movements fluid, silent, practiced. No one else stirred as she padded barefoot toward the door, her faint smile fixed in place even as her pulse quickened. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by emergency lamps. She moved like a shadow among shadows, her senses sharpening with every step. She turned a corner, and stopped. He was there. The man stood at the far end of the corridor, broad-shouldered, his presence filling the space even without a sound. His hair was streaked with gray now, his face lined with age, but his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, burning with that predatory gleam she remembered all too well. He had not come dressed like his men. No masks, no dark uniforms. He came as himself, the architect of her torment, the one who had forged her into the weapon she had become. Seeing him there was like a blade reopening an old scar, fresh blood flowing where she thought it had long healed. "Little wolf," he said, his voice low, steady, the same voice that had once commanded her to fight, to bleed, to break. "I wondered how long it would take before we met face to face again." Her faint smile didn't waver, though her hands curled into fists at her sides. "You came yourself," she said softly. "I must have made you very desperate." He chuckled, the sound deep and hollow. "Not desperate. Curious. You've embarrassed my men, humiliated them. That makes you a problem. But problems are best solved at the source. His eyes narrowed, sharp as a knife. "And you've always been my finest creation. It's time you came home." The word home struck her like a blow, though she didn't flinch. Home. To him, it had been the cages, the arenas, the endless fights under blinding lights while men screamed and wagered over her survival. To her, it had been a prison, a place where her humanity was stripped away until only the weapon remained. She had escaped, but he still thought of her as his possession, his property. Her smile sharpened. "I'm not yours. Not anymore." He took a step closer, his boots echoing softly against the floor. "You think you can run forever? You think hiding among children makes you free? You are what I made you. You can't change that. You can only embrace it." Her body was coiled, every muscle taut, but her voice remained calm, smooth, almost mocking. "Funny. You sound like a man trying to convince himself." For a moment, the mask of composure cracked and anger flickered in his eyes. "You forget who taught you everything you know," he hissed. "Every strike, every move, every way you've broken men twice your size, you carry me in every bone of your body. You can't erase that." She took a slow step forward, her bare feet whispering against the floor. The distance between them shrank, but her smile remained faint and unbroken. "You're right," she said softly. "I can't erase it. But I can end it." They moved at the same time. He lunged with the precision of a predator, his hand reaching to seize her throat as he had done so many times before, a gesture of dominance he believed unshakable. But she was faster. Her body flowed like water, slipping past his grasp, her arms snapping upward to strike his shoulder with bone-crushing force. He staggered, the sharp crack of bone echoing through the hall. His growl of pain filled the air, but his eyes blazed with fury rather than fear. "You've grown," he snarled, clutching his injured arm. "But don't think for a second you can finish me." Recruits had stirred now, doors opening along the hallway, wide-eyed faces peering out into the chaos. The female instructor appeared from the far end, her voice sharp and commanding. "Everyone back. Now." But none of them moved, rooted by the sight of the girl locked in battle with a man who seemed to radiate menace like heat. He advanced again, favoring his injured arm but still lethal, his strikes fast and brutal. She met him blow for blow, her movements a storm of precision. Each strike he threw was one she had learned to survive years ago, every trick of his hand one she had been forced to endure and adapt against. But she was not the same girl who had once fought for his approval in a cage. She was sharper, faster, stronger. And for every move he made, she had already crafted a counter. Still, the fight was no dance. His strength was monstrous, his rage driving him forward with relentless force. He slammed her against the wall, the impact rattling through her bones, but she twisted free, her elbows smashing into his jaw with enough power to stagger him again. Blood stained his lip, his teeth bared in a snarl. "You think you've escaped me," he spat, "but you carry me with you. Every smile, every strike, it's me. You'll never be free." Her smile widened slightly, though her eyes burned with something deeper than calm. "Then I'll kill the part of me that's you." With that, she drove forward, unleashing a flurry of strikes so fast the recruits could barely follow. Her fists, elbows, and knees became a storm of motion, every blow targeting his weak points, every strike breaking him down piece by piece. He tried to counter, tried to overpower her, but his age and his arrogance betrayed him. With a final twist, she seized his arm, the same one that had once grabbed her throat countless times, and snapped it backwards with brutal precision. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, his scream tearing through the hallway. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, broken but not yet defeated. His eyes glared up at her, full of venom, full of promises of vengeance. But she stood over him, calm, her breathing steady, her smile faint and unbroken. "You don't own me," she said softly, each word slicing sharper than any strike. "Not anymore. Not ever again." The female instructor stepped forward then, her face tight with restrained fury, and signaled the guards who had rushed in. They seized him, dragging him away despite his curses, his threats, his promises that this wasn't over. His voice faded into the distance, swallowed by the night, leaving only silence in its wake. The recruits stared at her, wide-eyed, as though they had witnessed not a fight but a revelation. She stood there, composed, serene, as though the storm of violence had never touched her. Only the faint tremor in her fingers betrayed the truth, that this had not been just another fight. It had been a battle with the ghost of her past, and though she had won, the scars still burned beneath her calm exterior. She turned then, meeting the gaze of the female instructor. For a long moment neither spoke. Then the instructor gave a single, firm nod, a silent acknowledgement of the truth they both knew. The past was not finished. The man might be broken, but the shadow of what he had built still lingered. There would be others. There would always be others. And she, smiling faintly, was ready for them. The days that followed his capture carried a silence heavier than any battle. The academy felt like it was holding its breath, every recruit moving through drills with eyes darting toward her as though waiting for another storm to strike. The man's screams and curses still echoed in the walls of memory, his threats a shadow that lingered even after guards had dragged him away in chains. Everyone expected her to break now, to unravel under the weight of it. But she didn't. She walked the halls the same as always, faint smile on her lips, movements precise, calm radiating from her like an armor no one could dent. Yet beneath that mask she felt something she had not allowed herself in years: release. For the first time since her escape she had faced him directly. For the first time she had not survived him. She had defeated him. But peace was fragile. She knew better than anyone that men like him never operated alone. He had built an empire of blood and control, and though he had been dragged away, the roots of that empire were still alive. His men, his networks, his influence, those things did not vanish with the breaking of his bones. She had cut down the master, but shadows moved best without light, and she could feel them already stirring beyond the academy walls. The whispers were not just among recruits now. They came from officers in hushed meetings, from instructors exchanging tense looks when they thought no one noticed. The academy had not expected to be dragged into a war with criminals who thrived in the dark, and now they faced the reality that they were. All because of her. One evening, as the recruits filed out of the mess hall, the female instructor asked her to stay behind. They sat in the empty room, the faint smell of food still in the air, the silence pressing close around them. The instructor's eyes, sharp as ever, fixed on her with an intensity that carried no judgment, only truth. "You know it won't end here," she said. The girl inclined her head slightly, her faint smile never leaving. "I know. They'll come again. Stronger, harder, more desperate. And when they do, this academy won't be able to shield you. You have to make a choice: stay here and put them all in danger, or leave and face them on your own." For the first time the smile faltered. Her eyes lowered to the table, her voice quiet. "All my life I've run. From cages, from shadows, from him. Every time I thought I found a place to rest, the past pulled me back. I came here because I thought maybe I could disappear. Maybe I could stop being what he made me." She lifted her eyes again, calm returning, but something raw flickered beneath it. "But I see now disappearing isn't living. And if I keep running, they'll never stop chasing me. So maybe the only way to end this is to stop running." The instructor leaned back, her expression unreadable, though respect flickered in her eyes. "If that's your decision, then you can't face it alone. Weapons cut deeper when guided by purpose. You've spent years being their weapon. Now it's time to choose what you'll fight for." Her smile softened, faint but real. "I'll fight for myself." Word spread quickly after that, though no one knew the details. The recruits sensed it in the air, in the way the instructors carried themselves, in the way she moved with a new steadiness, as if she had decided something final. They whispered less now, not because fear had faded but because awe had replaced it. They had seen her shatter men, seen her stand against the figure who had haunted her, and now they understood she was not someone they could measure themselves against. She was something else entirely. That night, she stood at the edge of the training yard, the stars scattered across the sky above her. The air was cool, the silence deep, but her thoughts were sharp, alive with the clarity of her decision. She could not erase the past. She could not undo what had been carved into her bones, the scars that shaped her. But she could choose what to do with it. She could let it chain her forever, or she could wield it as her own. Not as his creation, not as anyone's weapon, but as herself. The female instructor stepped up beside her, silent for a long moment before speaking. "When they come again, we'll be ready. You won't stand alone." She turned her head, faint smile curving her lips. "I never did." The days stretched into weeks, and the academy continued its rhythm, drills and discipline flowing as always. Yet beneath the surface, everything was different. Guards were sharper, instructors stricter, recruits more focused. They all felt the weight of what had happened, and in their own way they prepared for what might come. But she did not dwell on the fear of shadows. For the first time she began to teach, not in words but in presence. Recruits who once feared her now watched her with reverence, mimicking her movements, absorbing her calm. Without meaning to, she had become more than the girl who smiled while snapping shoulders. She had become their proof that strength could be found in survival, that even the sharpest blade could cut a path of its own. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in crimson, she found herself on the mat again, recruits gathered around, instructors watching silently. They had asked her to demonstrate, to spar with one of the strongest trainees. She agreed, stepping forward with her faint smile as always. The boy came at her fast, determined, his strikes sharp. She flowed around him with ease, her counters precise but restrained, her movements teaching rather than destroying. When it ended, the boy stood panting, sweat dripping down his face, but his eyes burned with something new, admiration. She looked around then, at the recruits, at the instructors, at the place she had once thought of as only a refuge to hide in. She saw now that it was more. It was not her cage. It was her forge. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was shaping something new. Later that night, lying on her bunk, she closed her eyes and let herself breathe deeply. The shadows outside the walls still lingered. She knew men like him had many allies, many replacements, and that sooner or later, another wave would come. But she no longer feared it. She no longer saw herself as running. She saw herself standing. The past might still hunt her, but she was no longer prey. She was the storm waiting to meet it. And as sleep finally claimed her, her faint smile lingered, unbroken as ever. Because she knew now, without doubt, that she had snapped more than his shoulder in that fight. She had snapped the hold of her past. And nothing, not shadows, not empires, not cages, could ever claim her again. The end.